Today is March 16th, 2013. I'm interviewing Dennis Savage at his home in Wallingford, Connecticut. Interviewer is Eileen Hurst from Central Connecticut State University. Dennis, would you state your full name, your date of birth, and the city and state you live in?
Yes, Dennis Michael Savage. Date of birth is June 19th, 1946 in New Haven, Connecticut.
And your present city and state?
I live in Wallingford, Connecticut.
In which war did you serve?
It would be the Vietnam era.
Which branch of the service?
United States Army.
Dennis, what was your highest rank?
Colonel.
In what general locations did you serve?
Served in the Connecticut Army National Guard and then in the Ohio Army National Guard.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted.
Where were you living at the time? Do you recall the date?
Yes, it was January 1967. I was living in West Haven, Connecticut.
Why did you enlist?
Well, I actually wanted to go on active duty and when as an infantry officer, but they said my eyes were too bad and had to go as a supply specialist, which I did. And from there, I went to the Connecticut Army National Guard Officer Candidate Program, which I was able to obtain a position as an infantry officer. So in other words, as an enlisted guy, my eyes weren't good enough to be an infantryman, but as an officer, it was okay. I don't know why, but that's the way it worked out.
So when you enlisted in the Army, regular Army?
No, it was the Army National Guard.
It was the National Guard right then. Where did you go for your basic training? Did you leave immediately to go there?
I went in June of 1967 to Fort Bragg, North Carolina for basic training. And after basic, I was transferred to Fort Lee, Virginia for special supply training.
What was your training at Fort Bragg like?
It was hot. It was pretty intensive in that it was the summer of 1967. It was a difficult time in Vietnam. Plus, it was a difficult time in the United States because of the race riots, the anti-war riots, and it was a difficult time all around.
What kinds of things did they train you at Fort Bragg?
Rifle marksmanship, life-saving methods. There was a lot of drill and ceremony so that you've proper formation and the proper times. We lived in World War II barracks that basically hadn't changed since 1945. And it's 2 floors, 1 big latrine down on the first floor. And a lot of the other training was bayonet training, obstacle training, and a lot of rifle range training.
Was there any classroom training or was it all field work?
Most of it was field work. There was some classroom training, things such as the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and I believe there was some nuclear, biological, and chemical training in the classroom. And then after that, we were put into a tent and exposed to tear gas or something of that nature.
In January of '67, the Vietnam War was heating up. Why did you decide to enlist at that time?
Well, I was still in college. I wanted to finish college and then go on active duty, but it did not work out that way. And so that I could finish college, I went into the Guard. And like I said, when I finished college, I wanted to go on active duty. When I got commissioned, I had orders to go to Fort Benning and do my basic officer course. And then at that point, I was going to find a way to go on active duty, but they canceled the orders for all National Guard people. And it was a much different Army in those days. And the National Guard was looked down upon as draft dodgers, basically, even though it was a legal and honorable way to serve. But and then at that point, I was finished school and we were married, so it ended up not working out the way we wanted to, or at least the way I wanted it to.
After you finished your basic at Fort Bragg, what was the training at Fort Lee like, and how long did that last?
Training at Fort Lee was just over 2 months. It was more of the classroom training. Because of the number of people going through the training, we had I think it was 6 at night to 3 in the morning classroom training. So
6 at night till 3 a.m.?
That's correct. And ended up marching to class. It was close. The training was all, like I say, classroom, everything from typing to record keeping. And the class also included a weapons repair portion. So there was 3 weeks, and basically World War II weapons. That's what we were still fighting with, from the M14 down to the M1 and BAR and the grease gun, the old .45 caliber automatic weapon.
Now, at that point, you were being trained for the supply side of things. Did you know that you were going to be in the supply end of the Guard?
Yes, I did. And when I came back, I served for about a year and a half as a supply man with the 1st Battalion, 102nd Infantry in New Haven, which was one of the most decorated units of World War I. And very interesting unit that saw a lot of action on the trenches of Europe.
After your 2 months at Fort Lee, and you came back to New Haven, you said you were there for about a year and a half in the supply battalion. What were your responsibilities in New Haven, and did you, as a National Guards, was it a commitment where you worked there every day, or was it a weekend and 2 weeks in the summer kind of thing?
2 weeks in the summer and 1 weekend per month. And then we were classified as a SRF, which was Select Reserve Force, where we drilled 2 weekends a month, and still the 2 weeks in the summer. The 26th Infantry Division was one of the units that was put in this SRF program because they were planning on mobilizing the 26th Infantry Division for duty in Vietnam.
And you were part of the 26th Division?
That's correct.
How long had you been working in the New Haven supply battalion before you knew you were going to be SRF?
It was a little over a year. And as that happened, the governors of the states of Connecticut, I believe it was Vermont, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, all protested or objected to the 26th Division being activated because there were so many of the Vietnam anti-war protests and the civil rights protests that were going on in the cities, and the police couldn't handle it, so the Guard was called up.
During the time you were at New Haven, what were your responsibilities?
Well, I worked with the property book officer, which is the man who is in charge of keeping the records on every piece of equipment that is held in the infantry battalion. So therefore, it's prior to computerization, so there was a piece of paper and it was like a 3x6 piece of paper that was all bound up into a hardcover and records had to be kept on each one, when they were inspected, when they were received originally, and then when they were disposed of or turned in. So everything from a truck to a pistol was tracked that way.
And you were responsible for that?
Well, partly. There was a warrant officer and a supply officer that oversaw what, I think there was 6 enlisted men who did this work within the armory in New Haven.
Who decides to make the battalion the select reserve force? Was that the governor's choice?
No, it was the federal government. It was the Department of Defense. Unlike what people think of the Guard, think of it as a state entity, but it really isn't. It's a reserve of the federal government. They happen to be based in each state, but unless the governor chooses to activate the Guard, the Guard would not be paid by the federal government, but paid by that state.
They're paid by the state if the governor of that state activates them?
That's correct.
But otherwise, they're paid by the federal government?
That's correct. Such as the recent snowstorm, where Guard units were activated. They were activated by the state of Connecticut, paid by the state of Connecticut to use the military equipment to remove the snow.
When the 26th was declared an SRF, they informed you, so then you knew if you were activated you would be going overseas?
As I understand it, would be a training up period, and we would become more not conducive, but more teamwork orientated. And there was two theories that they were going to send us to Europe to take the place of a European infantry division, and that division from Europe would go to Vietnam. And then the other train of thought was that the 26th would go to Vietnam. Not fully understanding what was taking place, because I was only a E4 at the time. It's questionable, or not knowing it, but that's what it sounded like.
When you were made SRF, was it still the 2 weekends in a month and the 2 weeks in the summer, or did your responsibilities to the Guard increase?
The responsibilities increased. We were training actually every Monday night and 2 weekends that month.
Where would you do your training?
On the weekends, it would be at the Stones Ranch Military Reservation down in the Niantic area, where we'd do the field training. We'd do rifle range training. I believe at that time was twice a year. And then on Monday nights was only armory training, which was many times we would do preparation for rifle range, where we would do what they call dry fire, and you'd zero in your weapon. And other classes included the UCMJ, Uniform Code of Military Justice, and that type of training on the Monday nights.
Monday night was at the New Haven Armory?
New Haven Armory.
Now, you said the governor wanted to activate you, or he did activate?
The only time the governor, at least when I was in the 102nd Infantry, was on the May Day, 1st of May through I believe it was the 5th of May, 1970. Where we were called up for, at that point I had finished officer candidate school and was a brand new second lieutenant. And it was an anti-war rally held on the New Haven Green, and by the Yale Co-op, the Yale bookstore, we were assigned a position to secure those buildings, because there was a lot of looting, broken windows, and so forth in other cities. And Connecticut actually planned it a little bit better. Every guardsman in the state of Connecticut was in New Haven or in the vicinity of New Haven. There was a battalion of the United States Marines based as backup in Rhode Island at Quonset Point, and a battalion of the 82nd Airborne up at Westover Air Force Base to back us up. We never needed that backup, but because of the force that was located or based in Connecticut, there was hundreds of buses that did not come to Connecticut to go for this rally, but there was still many, many people. I never saw the green, but they say it was elbow to elbow. We were stationed by the Yale Co-op. We had a police officer with each platoon of about 40 men, and we were issued live ammunition. And the strange part was it was armor-piercing ammunition, which if one round was shot, it probably would go through as many people as it possibly could, which could be several. And we were prepared with tear gas, smoke grenades. The rioters were, we thought they were foolish at first because they were throwing half-filled bottles of beer at us, but they drank the beer and then urinated in the bottles and threw those at us. We were spit at. We were called baby killers. We were. It was pretty much a degrading exercise as far as Americans treating Americans. In those days, if you were in uniform, didn't care what service you were in, what branch you were in, you were considered a lowlife. And I got spit at many times going to a weekend drill. Cars around the New Haven Armory were overturned, and it was a scary time. We were briefed by the FBI prior to the New Haven rally.
How far ahead did you knew the rally was going to take place? It had been a scheduled event?
Yes, it was a scheduled event, and we knew, well, at least the state knew it was going to happen about 3.5 months out.
Oh, so you had time to prepare.
We had time to prepare, and General Walsh, I believe, was the adjutant general at the time, and he prepared the Guard very well. 1 or 2 weekends a month, we had riot control training, which was required at the time, and we would set up mock streets and practice the movements of troops down that street to discourage the looters and so forth. So it was a pretty interesting time. And when the FBI briefed us, we thought that it was going to be much worse than it was, because they were saying to expect casualties.
What were your feelings knowing that you were going to use live ammunition and tear gas and armor-piercing bullets against your fellow citizens?
Well, it was pretty scary. And the soldiers, that about 40 that where I was responsible for, didn't really expect much of a problem. They didn't expect that it would be much different than a normal weekend training session. But when my platoon sergeant, a Sergeant Franco, World War II vet, and I rolled out boxes of ammunition, each soldier got 16 rounds for the M1 that we were carrying. I ended up with many more rounds than I actually needed, and there was no place to carry them. So I gave them to a medic and hit them, because there was not enough pockets to carry all the ammunition I grabbed. But it was scary thinking that, even though these people opposed what the government was doing, either the racial integration or the war in Vietnam, they were American citizens. But being a legal force, a force that was intended to become part of a police keeping organization, we had to do our duty. And we did an excellent job. The soldiers there were a lot of tough kids in those days. I say kids because that's what we were. And there wasn't one of them that flinched, even being spit at.
Now, you were in charge of a group?
Yes, a platoon, an infantry platoon of 40 people. There were 4 squads involved in each platoon. And the 4 squads were basically all riflemen. There were automatic riflemen, and each platoon had its own each squad had its own sergeant that would be responsible for that squad. The platoon sergeant was the senior NCO within the platoon, and I, being a platoon leader, would be responsible for the whole platoon. There were 4 platoons in a company with a captain as the company commander.
Where was your specific platoon located?
We were right on the corner, and it was a Rexall drug store right on Broadway, just down from the Yale Co-op, and it was sort of a V shaped, and it was right near the cemetery on Broadway, or right off of Broadway. And that corner was our responsibility. Later in the evening, they put us, and why I'll never know, is in the middle of Broadway to secure the buildings, but we were right under streetlights and sort of exposed. And one of the more interesting things was we saw a person on top of the building what looked like a rifle. So I selected 3 of my guys that were expert riflemen. They at that point put our ammunition in their weapon, and the police officer and myself and a couple other NCOs went to the roof. It turned out to be a janitor with a mop, and but it was enough to scare the daylights out of 40 troops down there in the street. And I said to him, "What in the world are you doing?" And he says, "I just wanted to see what was going on." And I said, "Do you realize the consequences of your wanting to see what was going on?" And he said, "Well, I didn't think of that." But it was a scary thing. And the one thing that I said earlier about the adjutant general planning this out, it was the first, second, third, and we were kept on a couple extra days because we were the unit in New Haven. 4 days later, the Kent State shooting occurred where, and then later on I belonged to the Ohio National Guard, but they did not plan it out as well as Connecticut did. And those soldiers that were surrounded must have felt like Custer at the Little Bighorn, because they were outnumbered, with this screaming going on by the dissenters. It was really a scary situation. And so,
when in your instance in Connecticut at Yale, did you have any confrontation with the crowd or the rioters?
no,
Were there any problems?
no, there wasn't any physical confrontation whatsoever. It was more verbal and things being thrown at us. But the soldiers took it very, very seriously, and were very restrained in their actions. They did an outstanding job.
That evening of the first day, and you said you had to clear buildings, what was that like? What exactly did you have to do?
Well, that was pretty scary because you did not know what was behind the next corner. It could have been, somebody in an apartment. It was basically set up so that there weren't any surprises from that, lack of a better word, Yale Co-op block, because there was a lot of Yale buildings involved, and they're very historic buildings. It was scary. I had one soldier who just came back from Vietnam who said to me, you know, Lieutenant, I'd rather be back in Vietnam than doing this. So it was pretty scary time because you did not know what was coming next. The FBI told us, take your families and go somewhere else. Don't stay in your homes, because there was threats of against guardsmen, because it was the Black Panthers, the whole rally was started by a trial against a guy named Alex Rackley, and he had murdered one of the Black Panthers. And the rally started as a support for the Black Panther movement, and then it expanded to the anti-war movement, and let's blame everybody for what's going on, and it was pretty scary.
Now, you said this was a multi-day affair. Were you like on for X number of hours and then allowed to go home to sleep or go to the armory? How did the next days pan out?
Well, we did have again, they were smart about doing this. They did not leave us out on the street for an entire day. There was a shift, and I think it was 4 hours that our relief would come out, take our positions, and then we would march back to the armory, because we were only a matter of blocks from the armory itself. One instance was we went down a little street called Lake Place, and I'm in front of my platoon, and I heard this, it was a strange sound, and it turned out to be a big German Shepherd, and all I saw was teeth, and I said, there's going to be a riot here, and I'm going to start it because I'm going to shoot this dog. I never forget that in my mind. And then some youngster came out and says, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot I didn't have them tied up. But there were some comical things that took place.
Then would you stay at the armory until your next shift?
Yes, we did. And we'd spend again, the shift would run overnight, so we would basically sleeping on the floor of the armory, because there was no barracks per se within the armory walls. So each platoon had a separate room, which these rooms were 400 or 500 square feet, so they were pretty good sized rooms. And they would just roll out the sleeping bags, and a couple hours later you had nothing but snores in that room.
And this went on until May 5th? And that
Yes.
was the end of the riot?
Yes, it did. Like I said, we were kept an extra day because we were in the local area. At the time, I worked for the Seamless Rubber Company, which was in New Haven as a company. The building's still there. And I was able to go and get a couple dozen basketballs at the time they made, and at least we had the guys able to play basketball to keep their time occupied. A couple of the theaters loaned us projectors and movies. So again, trying to keep the troops occupied, because it was, again, why are we still here? It's over with. But
you said the FBI had warned you to worry about the security of your family. Did you do anything specific?
Well, at the time we had a 6-month-old youngster, and my wife, Martha, and I sent her and the baby up to North Haven, where my mom and dad lived, and they stayed there for the 4 or 5 days.
After that incident, what was your next step in your military career?
Shortly after that, I was working for the Seamless Rubber Company, and Seamless was a different kind of company, because they made, during World War II, they made a lot of the life vests for pilots. They made life rafts. There was a lot of handmade rubber goods there. And early 70s, actually the late 80s, they went into the production of surgeons' gloves. So they had a medical supply division, which I took a job as a medical supply representative, and my wife moved to Ohio. in Ohio.
Oh, so that's how you got to Ohio, was through your job?
Through my job, which was about 2.5 years, I
But
lived
the
in
whole time you
Ohio.
stayed in Connecticut, you stayed in the Connecticut National Guard?
That's correct.
What year and month, if you recall, month, did you move to Ohio?
We moved in December of 1971, and I was there until March of 74.
So when you went to Ohio for your job, do you transfer to a different National Guard, or do you have to quit one and join the other?
Well, you make out a temporary or release form, and they give you a number of weeks to, find a new unit in the state that you're moving to. And I looked up the units, and which was because we lived in Akron, and I found the unit in Cleveland, which was, the 107th Armored Cavalry Regiment. And I said, that sounds a little bit different than being an infantryman. So I was up in Cleveland, and we were a high priority unit. We had same equipment that active Army had, as far as an M551, which was a Sheridan that was a reconnaissance vehicle, but it had a 152 millimeter cannon on it. So it was, at the time, very high tech. You had to have secret or top secret clearance to get into it because it was technologically advanced for the time, computerization and so forth. And I was there for around 3 years. Interesting unit. One of my fellow platoon leaders his name was James R. Garfield the Fourth. He was the great grandson of the President of the United States. So there was a interesting group of both NCOs, enlisted folks, and officers.
Why did you decide to stay in the Guard when you went to Ohio? Because you wanted to, or because you were still committed for a certain number of years?
I could have easily gotten out at that point, but I really considered myself as a soldier, and many times to the distraction from my full-time civilian career, because it was being in the Guard is not strictly 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer. As I progressed up in grade, I found how much more responsibility there was. So in Ohio, we were able to train in different areas. The commanders had assigned areas in Germany to prepare ourselves for a war with the Russians. You know, the Soviet Union was the big threat, 60s, 70s, 80s, and then shortly into the 90s. But it was a serious threat, and that was one of the, I believe, the mistakes that the Army was making, is that they continued to train soldiers to fight in Europe when we were fighting in Southeast Asia, and not preparing the troops to fight there as much as they were for the European battles.
When you got to Ohio and shopped around, for lack of a better term, for a new unit, why did you choose the 107th Armored Cavalry? And can you, as a soldier, can you choose what unit you go into?
Well, you can, in the case of in the Guard, because the I don't remember what unit this was, but there was an infantry unit in Akron nearer to our home, but they did not have a vacancy and did not project to have a vacancy. So at that point, I went to the Armored Cavalry unit, and had to do a lot of basic officer courses again, because it branch qualified as an infantryman, but now I had to do the same thing as a cavalryman, armor officer. So
How was that different?
Well,
What different things did you learn that you didn't have experience in?
well, a lot of what the differences from the armored cavalry to the infantry was not so much doing a different job, but doing the same job, but much more rapidly, because you're moving as a armored cavalry platoon. And I mean, you're moving at 15, 20, 30 miles per hour versus, maybe 3 miles an hour as an infantryman. And now suddenly you may be an expert at reading a map as an infantryman because you got used to it. You're moving fairly slowly, but now at 25 miles an hour, I had to read the map much more rapidly and keep track of things. Other difference was driver training. I mean, you're driving a 10, 12, 14 ton, 20 ton vehicle, and a lot of falls that could result in multiple stitches, fingers that could get stuck in places. You got to be very, it ended up being in many cases not an expert, but someone who could physically change not a carburetor, but an intake manifold. I mean, some piece of that equipment that you could or would have to, take care of.
And you said you had to have special clearance, or
Well,
was it
secret.
because of that Sheridan?
Yeah, primarily the Sheridan. It was still used by the 82nd Airborne up to, maybe 10 years ago. It was light enough so that it could be two of them, I believe, carried in cargo aircraft. So it was easily transported. It was a very rapid vehicle. I mean, very speed-wise.
Was it new at the time in 1971?
Yes.
So can you describe as much about it as you can?
Well, the biggest difference was at the size of the cannon. The cannon could fire a conventional round, which was sort of different because it was like a big shotgun shell. You only had a base that was brass. The rest of it was like I say, a shotgun shell that was fiberglass that was impregnated with nitroglycerin. So as the round was fired, the whole basic round went downrange. And so all you had was a circle about that big and only about that thick, so you could pitch it out of the tank. And it also fired the Shillelagh missile, which was a anti-armor missile that designed again for the European theater that, thank goodness, we never had to fight. But the Shillelagh was optically sighted. There was you followed the target. You kept your sight on the target, and the big comment was, what we were doing then was, don't fly the missile, because a lot of guys would put their crosshairs, because you could see the missile as it went downrange, but you started to fly the missile, you flew it right into the ground. So if there was another piece of what you were shooting at was moving, you just kept your crosshairs on that moving vehicle, and the Shillelagh missile would fly to it. So that was a big difference there.
That was new at the time. Were they using it in Vietnam at all?
Yes, they did. They did use it in Vietnam because they also had a what they called a flechette round, was like a big shotgun shell. And in the jungle area, I mean, you could fire this out and hundreds of these little projectiles would go out, not long range, but short range, that would clear an area that would be a danger area for the soldiers. The vehicle was also able to swim. You'd have a flotation collar that would take about an hour for the troops to bring it up out of the sides of the vehicle. It would come up about 4 feet, and you could then drive it into, which we did down at AP Hill, Virginia, drive it into the water, and the motion of the tracks would give the vehicle the power to drive or right through the water obstacle.
So it was actually the tracks moving that
The
propelled the
tracks.
vehicle through the water?
That's correct.
What rank were you when you joined the Ohio National Guard?
I was a second lieutenant, and shortly after that, I became a first lieutenant.
What were your responsibilities specifically? Were you a platoon leader there as well?
Yes, I was a platoon leader there. There was 3 platoons and a maintenance platoon within the troop.
Were you still involved in the supply end of it?
No longer. Once I became commissioned, it was strictly being an infantryman and then a armored cavalryman.
What were your responsibilities in the Ohio Guard as a first lieutenant? Was it the training in the summer, and then how many weekends a month?
We were basically 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks during the summer, but it was a Monday night, each Monday night of the month. So basically we're probably...
So you were still training every Monday?
That's correct.
Does all the National Guard across the country use Monday night as training night?
Well, if it wasn't after we became not classified as SRF any longer, the Monday nights for the soldiers diminished a bit. But as a leader of the unit, in one way, shape, or form, we would have a planning meeting on Monday nights. So, my wife got used to, and then I think after a while we switched to Tuesday night because Monday night football became a question of, hey, maybe we can make Tuesday night so we can watch the game. So.
How long did you stay with the Ohio National Guard?
2.5 years, roughly. And then my company asked me to come back to Connecticut, which was a promotion for me, being in the sales force. Connecticut was the largest territory. So
again, it was your civilian job that brought you back to Connecticut?
That's correct.
Do you recall the year?
1974, we came back from Akron.
So when you came back to Connecticut, what did you do? You came back to the same New Haven area?
Yes, I went right back to the 1st Battalion, 102nd Infantry, and I was assigned as a supply officer for the headquarters company of the 102nd, primarily because I had to get branch transferred from, now I was an armor officer, and I had to get transferred back to being an infantry officer, and you could not be a platoon leader and not be an infantry officer. So that those papers had to go through the National Guard Bureau and the Pentagon so that I could become an infantry officer again.
Even though you'd already been one?
Yes.
Was it just a matter of paperwork?
Primarily, and you had to supply educational paperwork that proved that you had completed this course or that course so that you were able to become an infantry officer again, even though you were one at one time. And that's not unusual as units change. Many guys have to, if they go in from an infantry position to could be in a medical battalion, and not as a doctor, but as a officer, you've got to take more courses in order to become qualified.
So, what did you do as a supply officer while you were waiting for the paperwork?
Well, it was a short-term assignment,
Like a couple months?
a couple of months, and basically the people who I was part of as a specialist before I went to OCS, I was working with. So it was a homecoming almost, because there was still quite a few of the guys that were there that I served with as a specialist.
When your paperwork came through and you were back as an infantry officer, were you first lieutenant at this point?
Yes, I was. I got promoted in Ohio to first lieutenant.
This was 1974. The Vietnam War was over, but you decided to stay in. Had you decided at that point you wanted to make the National Guard a career?
Yes, I did. In fact, I remember talking to Jim Garfield, who was a good friend of mine in Ohio, and he said to me, you and I are career people, and, you want to stay even though it's tough. I mean, you put in a lot of time, and it's difficult. It's easy to say, I'm going to get out because of this reason or that reason. And a lot of good people got out because there were too many requirements, family requirements. They might be part of a PTA or a church organization that they felt that was important to them, and they couldn't fit into, or that requirement of being into the Guard, which not only time at drills, but educational time to do correspondence courses or 2 weeks active duty because the military always requires you to do another course. Civilian-wise, military-wise, today you can't, it's like being the Pope. You can't get there unless you have the education. So as I got back to the supply section, it was a short period of time that I was in the supply section. I got my branch transfer, and right after annual training in 1974, I was made a company commander in Danbury.
What did that entail?
Well, that entailed much more work than I ever done before in the Guard. And it was not close like New Haven. It was quite a ride.
Did you have to actually transfer over to Danbury?
Into Danbury. So I had soldiers from New York. I had soldiers from Connecticut. There was, again, a big cross-section of people. And it was, again, every Monday night we had, one of my best friends in the Guard, Louis Preziosi, he and I used to ride every weekend out to Danbury and then keep each other awake coming back at midnight. But it was very rewarding, and now I went up to about 250 people in the unit. So now I had an executive officer and 4 platoon leaders. We had 3 rifle platoons and 1 mortar platoon. So they've used the 81 millimeter mortar. They were basically the platoon's artillery support. So the 81 millimeter mortar was the weapon that the company commander commanded. So if he needed immediate fire support, it would come through that mortar platoon. That was his control.
And were you over these 4 platoons?
That's correct.
Commander of those?
That's correct.
So as commander, what did you have to do? What were you responsible for?
Well, I was responsible for recruiting new soldiers. That was the time period when the strength of the Guard began to get less, because the draft was basically ending. Vietnam was basically over. And the impetus for people to join the Guard was not there anymore. So you had to make a good reason or come up with good reasoning to um, ask guys to become soldiers in the Guard. Uh, the Guard was always looked down upon during Vietnam because they were called draft dodgers and so forth. But it was a legal way to commit or complete your obligation to become a soldier or an airman in the Air Guard. But it was still intense. You still had some of the guys who were joined during Vietnam that really weren't too enthusiastic about being there. I remember a general visiting my positions out in the field, and I told everybody in the company, this is what the answers should be, and this is what we're doing, and this is how we're doing it. And they all said, oh, they understood. Well, this general came around and looked in one of the fighting positions and said, how you doing, soldier? Beats the heck out of me. What's your job today? I have no idea. So there was a lot of, compared to the National Guard of 2013, 2013, almost 0% of the soldiers today have not been to Afghanistan or Iraq. A neighbor who was in the 102nd Infantry has been to both. He's been one tour in Iraq and one tour in Afghanistan. So the Guard has changed. In my 30 years of being in the Guard mostly as an officer, there's dramatic changes from what it was to what it is now.
When you were back as a commander, did a lot of the guys that came back from Vietnam join the Guard, or were they mostly non-vets?
It depended whether he was an officer or an enlisted guy. There were quite a few enlisted folks, NCOs primarily, that joined the Guard. There were a lot of officers. Some of them became my best friends. The guy I replaced in Danbury was probably the best soldier I ever knew.
And he had served in Vietnam, come home and joined the Guard after his...
That's correct. So he and I followed each other up the ranks and like I say, became good friends.
What was his name?
Steve Corden. Steve unfortunately had brain cancer and passed away. But
besides recruiting, what were your other responsibilities as the commander?
Well, training the soldiers, and we were still training to fight the Soviet Union.
Did you think if there was a fight, it would be a ground war?
There's the Fulda Gap in Germany, which sort of would be the pathway for the Russian armor to come down. And there were positions on the ground to support the active components in Germany. So we were, it would be probably a ground war. The Russians had a lot of tanks, and I think they were trying to, since their tanks could easily drive across Europe where ours had to be shipped, we made mobilization sites in Europe where we would put a lot of vehicles, but it isn't an instant get in them and drive away. So there's a lot of work for us there, but we had a good idea where physically they could come in, because a tank isn't, it's tough to drive the tank through the woods because you run into trees, you've got the opportunity for an infantryman to shoot them, with a anti-armor weapon, because they can't see as well. You're really blinded in a tank because you've got vision blocks for the tank commander and the driver, but the loader, he can't see anything. He's down in the lower part of the tank. So it would be, I would say that it would be a ground war in Europe.
So when you were training them to fight against the Soviet Union, if it should come to that, what kinds of things did you mostly train the men in?
Marksmanship training, that is always an important thing for infantrymen, is to know what, how to shoot your weapon the best way possible.
What were they using for weapons by this point?
At this point, we were up to the M16. When I first joined, we had the M1 from World War II. We never got M14s. We went right to the M16s. And much lighter weapon. And the early ones were automatic fire. And since then, they have had a 3-round burst because the automatic fire used up a lot of ammunition and it tended to rise from the end, and you didn't get the results that you wanted to get.
So marksmanship?
Marksmanship, we still had civil disturbance training. We had every month that the weather held, because we never really had cold weather equipment. We would be out in the field at Stone's Ranch or other local training areas that we were able to get to. We had a few in Connecticut, one at the Colebrook Dam area, which was a very good area. The water department owned the property and allowed us to fire blanks and use smoke and so forth, where Giuffrida Park in Meriden, you could only go there and do maneuvers. You could not do force-on-force training. So it was very specific as to the area that was available.
Was all of your training in Connecticut, though?
Connecticut, annual training was several different locations. On the weekends, we did go to Camp Edwards at Cape Cod to do our firing. The East Haven Rifle Range became not usable because people on the other side of the mountain said rounds were coming over the mountain into their houses. So that required us to take a convoy all the way to Massachusetts. Summertime, it's tough going around the rotaries on Cape Cod with several 2.5-ton trucks. We're lucky we never ended up having accidents. If there were minor accidents.
Were there any other civil disturbances that you guys were called up for?
No, not to my knowledge. But in that time frame, they still were concerned.
How long did you stay as the company commander in Danbury?
Close to 3 years.
And then where did you go?
Then I went back to the headquarters in New Haven as the motor transportation officer. And that was with the 102nd Infantry. In that position, I was responsible for the quality of service, the amount of service to the vehicles that were assigned to the 102nd Infantry. And those were everything from the old Jeep to a 2.5-ton truck to wreckers, to retrieve vehicles. I took and part of the education part was that I took a 2-week course at Fort Knox, Kentucky, that covered maintenance. And it was an excellent active duty school that you could learn an awful lot from as far as maintenance on vehicles, how vehicles worked as far as drivetrains and...
Did you have any prior experience with vehicles?
Only in the Ohio Guard, where, I had 9 armored vehicles in my platoon. But not an awful lot other than high school and college working at a gas station.
Why did they change you to be the motor transportation officer? Do you have a choice, or can you elect what you want to go to, or is it just whatever's open and they need you?
Well, whatever's open is the primary reason, and it's a progression of as a career in the Guard as an officer or an enlisted NCO, there's a progression of positions. So
When you changed here, did your rank go up?
no, I was still a captain.
Oh, when did you get made a captain? Last
Oh,
I knew it was first lieutenant.
I'm sorry. Yes, I got promoted in 1974 as I was a company commander. So I was a captain in, I think, 9 years. Used to call myself the captain forever. But so as the motor transportation officer, I was only there about a year, and it gave you a broader experience level as a higher ranking commander as to your vehicles and your unit and how they were used to accomplish your mission. So therefore, if you didn't keep track of your vehicles as a battalion commander, you couldn't accomplish your mission because you have 4 vehicles down, and how are you going to transport your troops or your supplies or anything you needed to transport without having those vehicles in a ready position? So as the MTO, motor transportation officer, the armory in Ansonia had all of the, now there's our full-time technicians within the Guard as well. Now these full-time people took care of taking care of the vehicles on a full-time basis. So not only were they guardsmen, but they were employees, civil service employees, to take care of these vehicles.
After your year as the transportation officer, where'd you go?
At that point, they moved me to the assistant S3 Air, which was up at Brainerd Field, and it was at the higher headquarters, the 43rd Infantry Brigade. And the 43rd was the remains of the 43rd Division from World War II.
So you weren't part of the 102nd anymore?
No longer. The brigade headquarters was the headquarters that the 102nd, the 2nd Battalion of the 102nd, and the 1st Battalion of the 169th Infantry, plus an battalion of artillery worked for the brigade. Now, as the Brigade S3 Air, I worked on the staff of the S3, which is...
What does S3 stand for?
It's a staff position, and the staff positions are broken down into the S1, which was personnel. That person took care of the records, shot records. The chaplain worked for the S1. You did all of that paperwork. It's more of an administrative position than the other 3 positions. The S2 was the intelligence officer. So their job was to obtain intelligence from sources from the division headquarters, from the scout platoons, and then advise the commander as to what the opposition would be looking like and where they might be attacking from. So, and also he covered the weather. So he did the weather work as well. He had a staff on the brigade level. The S1, 2, 3, and 4 are a major position. And 04 that had quite a staff working for them. The S3 being operations, he would be the officer that was in charge of the tactical operations for the commander. So he would come up with usually 3 options for in this case, the brigade commander, that it could be, we could move towards the enemy in this position, attack this way, or the option of going the other way, or should we hold our position and see what they do, type of thing, a hypothetical of all of
Now,
those.
was that your position?
No, I was one of the assistants. I coordinated the air movements. So I worked with the aviation battalion and any other aviation asset that could be utilized for the brigade to accomplish its mission.
So now you're in another new field of aviation. Had you had any prior experience with aviation?
Other than that, as a company commander, having our troops fly, so I would request to that current S3 Air how to get the aviation support for my company. So that was an interesting portion. Now, instead of looking for just my company, I'm responsible for the entire brigade.
How large is a brigade?
The brigade had 3 infantry battalions, a artillery battalion, and they were what they call slices of the division. Like the aviation battalion here in Connecticut was part of the aviation brigade in Massachusetts. So each brigade and the division of 26th Division had support from the division down to the brigade. So it's like a pyramid. You've got a lot of infantrymen down here. The division headquarters is up top, and then you get slices or bits and pieces of that division to support that brigade.
And you're responsible for all of those?
No, as the S3 Air, I was responsible for the aviation portion. So that's where the S1, 2, 3, and 4 play in. So they work with the division headquarters. So division would pass information down to the brigades. The brigades would pass information down to the battalions.
How long were you the assistant at the S3?
It was about a year and a half, and it allowed me another school. I went to Eglin Air Force Base. Eglin has about 4 different air bases under their control, and it was the one called Hurlburt Field, and it's down on the panhandle of Florida. Hurlburt Field was and I think it still is, the center for a lot of clandestine operations. They have the AC-30 gunships there where they have support for troops, and it's a flying gun platform. They even fire a 105 millimeter cannon from this airplane. So I went down to this class, and it was 2 weeks, secret information. It was interesting because it was an Army and an Air Force program. And all the Army guys went to one side of the room, all the Air Force guys went to the other side of the room, and then when the instructor came out and says, "This is your assignment for seating," and they it was like boy, girl, because the Air Force guy and the Army guy, and it was a very, very interesting school because you got to meet some very, we used to call high-speed people that were very advanced in their courses. Just for instance, I sat next to an Air Force Academy graduate who was an Air Force pilot in Vietnam. And this was not a school that you sat there and took notes and you then left. There were 4 exams and covered a broad range of information. Everything from calling in air support from the Air Force, but planning fire missions from your own artillery. So it was tough. We had to study on the weekends because we had 4 exams. We had a pre-exam that would tell the instructors where is this class as far as knowledge? And then you had 3 exams after that. And we had several that did not pass. They got a certificate for attending, but they did not get a diploma. That Air Force major who sat next to me, the Air Force Academy graduate, out of the 3 exams, he got 1 question wrong. I was very impressed by this man, and amazing the class. It covered everything: naval aviation, what the Air Force could do for a Army unit, everything from air support to dropping those Sheridans I talked about out of an airplane that hadn't stopped or landed. They would be pulled out of the airplane by a parachute and be in a crate, and the Sheridan would bounce along until it stopped, and then the soldiers could pick it up and go off on a mission. So there was a very interesting school, and it was 2 weeks for the infantry guys, or the Army guys per se, and then 3 weeks for the Air Force guys, because they had to learn how to live in the woods. So where they figured the Army guys didn't need that training, but the Air Force usually have nice
Did you
barracks.
guys in the Army and the Air Force, did you end up being more competitive or collaborative?
More collaborative. It got, it got interesting. I mean, they tried to add some humor to it, like real strange landings on aircraft carriers by Navy pilots, and it was, it was very well done, an excellent course. And that part of Florida, it was cold in the wintertime, being up on the Panhandle, but it was still Florida.
After that training, you came back to Brainerd?
Yes, I did. I came back to Brainerd. In a short period of time, I moved up to the assistant S3, which was a little bit more involved as the assistant S3, because you are responsible for training plans, training schedules, all of that kind of thing.
What were you before?
I was the S3 Air, and then I became the assistant S3.
Okay.
On the ladder, or as you moved up the ladder, the assistant S3 is a higher position than the S3 Air. He's not just looking for air assets or enabling air assets to support us. He's working on the big picture versus one specific slice.
So how long were you the assistant S3?
I was there, and I was still a captain. I was there about 3 years, and it turned out that I was able to spend some additional time with the S3 because he had a heart attack prior to us going to annual training, and I became the S3 as a captain. So it was...
Is that unusual?
Well, it is unusual, but it's something to be expected in the military because you could never tell what would be happening to your boss. And basically, I took over from my boss and went to 2 weeks active duty doing his job. I had a brief generals, I had a brief colonels, and it was an interesting annual training period that I suddenly had responsibility I didn't expect to have 3 weeks before, because...
How did it work out?
It worked out excellently because I was prepared well. We had a very successful annual training period.
Where was it?
Fort Drum, New York, way upstate New York, almost to Canada, and a very large training area. And it was the point of a chance for me to be promoted, because shortly after that I made major and I became the signal officer for the brigade.
What does the signal officer do?
Well, I never had to get a branch transfer to the Signal Corps, but I was able to worked with this. Each battalion had a signal officer, and they had what they called an SOIS, Signal Operations. Now I forget what it was, but it was a method of correct communications over a radio or radio system. So if you talked on the radio like you and I are talking now, anybody could listen to it and know exactly what we're saying. But there was secure methods that we had to use. There were a daily change in the signal operations information. So therefore, it was also a lot of secure information. I went to another class up at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, about how to be a signal operations officer for the brigade, and it wasn't the most liked assignment I had, but it was something that enabled me to become a major. In fact, I was promoted to major at a formation of the 26th Infantry Cavalry, Army Cavalry out in Yakima, Washington. I was out there for 2 weeks with high desert. I was in a tree to be seen, just sagebrush and rattlesnakes. But the guy that was the troop commander called me in front. I thought he was just going to say thank you for helping, and he promoted me. So
And you didn't know it was coming?
I didn't know it was coming, and the paperwork had come in from the Pentagon, and he got the word from Connecticut, and they promoted me. So I flew home as a major. So it was interesting. And the reason I got to go was because of my cavalry training in Ohio, because I knew something about it. And at the time, civilian-wise, I was still a salesman, and I was able to get the extra 2 weeks, as I got 4 weeks vacation, but which ate up our vacation time. So, but it worked out well.
How long were you the signal officer for brigade?
A very short time, less than a year.
Then what did you do?
And I became the S3 for the 1st Battalion, 169th Infantry in Manchester.
What were your responsibilities there?
Well, again, the training. Now, from going at the brigade training level, I'm down to the battalion training level, where you follow operations orders from the higher headquarters, being the brigade, and you're responsible for writing an operations order for the battalion. And again, you may give the battalion commander 2 or 3 options. He picks the proper option and chooses that, and at that point, you write a complete operations order. So that was a demanding job. It took a lot of time. You had to, and you had a full-time person working for you that you were able to schedule rifle ranges, schedule training areas, check with the transportation officer about getting vehicles. Is there a requirement for the administration officer to get shots? When we're going to schedule the
Immunization.
Yeah, thank you. My tongue got tied. But those basic operational or administrative skills that had to be applied by the medical platoon. And so you got training for the medical platoon as well as training from the riflemen.
And how long were you in that position?
2.5 years.
Then what did you do?
I went from there to the executive officer for the same battalion.
And still in Manchester?
Still in Manchester. We had armories in Rockville. At one point, all the way out to Danielson, almost to the Rhode Island border, and New Britain. So we had armories in basically 5 different locations.
And where were you living?
Right here in Wallingford.
So you had to do a lot of traveling.
Yes, we did.
With all of these different placements, different places you
Mhm.
were at.
That's correct. And also, it wasn't just for the drill weekends. It was things that called the pre-camp reconnaissance, where you would go to Fort Drum and look at what ranges and training areas you would be able to use or have to use during your training, active duty training. When we first got into Guard, they required 88 hours of training within a 2-week period. People got the weekends off, and you only spent 4 days in the field. By the time I became the S3, there were no more weekends off. You you traveled on Saturday, went out training on Sunday, came back on Thursday, cleaned the equipment, set up for the convoy to come back. It was about 300 miles up there, and you would have to drive all the way back from New York to your home armories, whether they be in Manchester or New Haven or Danbury.
Dennis, this might be a good time to talk about the balance of, because this is a huge time commitment, and especially driving all over the place for all these years that you were in, 28 to 30 years. How did you balance your military work on top of a full-time job and a full-time family?
I think any National Guardsman that has any position of responsibility has to sacrifice all things. I mean, I was lucky to have civilian bosses that understood. A couple of them were prior service people that were, I know you're going to be gone. I'll take care of this customer or that customer. I not only had to learn my military side, but I was selling medical products in operating rooms. So it was sort of a paradox. I was the lifesaver in my civilian job, and I was the paid killer, basically, in my military job. We missed a lot of vacations, family-wise, weddings, birthday parties. My wife just got used to it, and it was part of the experience. We would take 3 or 4 days of vacation instead of a week. We would go closer to home instead of going to Florida. So I was lucky from one standpoint. My mom and dad took the kids to Disney a couple of times with my wife, and because it was just impossible to do. I mean, any guardsman that reaches the rank of sergeant major or command sergeant major or colonel has put in that much time. And now today it's even more, because you have a real live mission of going to Afghanistan at this period of time. And, as a colonel or as a first sergeant, you've got a lot of responsibilities. And I mean, you're really talking a combat situation. In reality, we were only planning for combat situations in the 80s when I had higher level positions. So that's the difference. It's a real commitment to people. And quite a few of my peers, they dropped out of the wayside because it got to be too much. I can't do the Command and General Staff College because I don't have the time. So they ended up getting, if they didn't have the time, then they ended up being discharged because they never had their education completed. My chaplain, the greatest chaplain I ever saw, Father Ziska from Manchester, he had to get out because he never got his Command and General Staff College done. And he didn't have a wife and kids per se because he was a priest. How do you fight that? And it's a difficult fight. So
were you able to separate your military from in your civilian? So when you'd go back to civilian life and be at your job, were you focused on that, or were you still thinking about National Guard stuff?
No, I think I was able to switch from back and forth. I might be at supper time making calls for the guard. Um, and, you know, I'd plan my sales day towards Danbury. So I would visit the hospital in Peekskill, the one in Danbury, the one up in New Milford. So I was on Mondays, in many cases, on the western side of the state. And when I moved to Manchester, I would plan it around going to Manchester Hospital, Hartford Hospital, so that, again, I was more or less able to. It's not like I was tied to an office at that point. I was able to be a little flexible in the day or the place I was working that day.
After you were the executive officer in Manchester, where did you go?
I stayed right in Manchester and became the battalion commander.
How long were you the battalion commander?
4 years, just about 4 years.
And did that just mean an increase in responsibilities?
Yes, I now had 1/3 of the brigade's infantry's potential, and at that point I was also in a lieutenant colonel slot, so I was able to be promoted to lieutenant colonel. Again, it's, you know, the planning. So now all those staff positions we talked about earlier, the S1, 2, 3, and 4, now we're all working for me and becoming a cohesive staff and a team. I mean, the military is a team, like a football team. You all have different jobs, but the objective is making a touchdown, and that's basically what we do. And the responsibility gets bigger than you had prior to that. So
we're going to end part 1 here, and
okay.
we'll resume with part 2.